Well, hi again, everyone. We have another SMC discussion for you all today on surface water depletion. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen yet again and get started on our presentation. So give me a moment. Sure. And here we go.
Yeah. So this is part one of two dealing with the surface water depletion. Here, I think Megan are going to start us to kind of a little bit background about the surface water depletion, and then we're going to spend quite a time going through the information we have, basically what we know and what we don't know, and then at the latter part of the meeting, I'm going to kind of discuss about options. What option do we have for setting the monitoring network, the representative monitoring network, as well as also what type of MO and MTs we might set up. So that will be a discussion, and then hopefully next meeting we'll come back with to address some additional comments or concern that is raised during this meeting, and maybe also the outline of a proposal for what those MT might look like based on the guidance we get today. It's all yours, Megan.
All right. So Ibrahim just walked us through the agenda, really. So again, doing a high level, very quick review. I know we've all talked at length, and this is the fourth meeting on SMCs, and so we're defining all of these terms that we keep on throwing out, the word salad. But we're going to just do a very high level brief review, summarize what we know, we don't know, and then discuss next steps. So, in Sigma, we've got these 6 sustainability indicators, and this workshop and ad hoc is really focusing on the surface water depletion piece of the puzzle. And so the undesirable results that, as defined in the water code, is the one that we're focusing on, is depletion of interconnected surface water that have significant and unreasonable adverse impacts on beneficial uses of the surface water. So, in previous meetings, you all talked about who are the beneficial users and the impacts that we could see. So we're just going to dive in a little bit to that specific to surface water. So before we go in, we're going to throw a couple of technical jargon at you. Some of you might be familiar with this, some of you this might be new, so we want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So when we say things like hydrologically connected or gaining or losing stream, we all have a common understanding of what that means. So hydrologically connected is when you have a saturated condition that allows for the movement of water between 2 or more sources. So groundwater and surface water, or between 2 different aquifers, and that is happening in the pictures A and B. Hydrologically disconnected means that there's a portion that there's no saturation, there's not water there, and it limits the movement between 2 or more sources of water. So you can have it's hydrologically connected or disconnected. And then on top of that, there are gaining streams or losing streams. So the gaining stream is shown in figure A, and that is when the stream is getting more water from the groundwater table. So the groundwater table is up high and the stream is lower in elevation, and you have additional water coming in from the aquifer feeding the stream. But then you can also have the opposite situation happen, where the surface water is actually contributing and losing water to the aquifer, and that's shown in figure B. And we just want to also note that all of these conditions are variable. It depends on the segment of the stream. You can have a segment of a stream that is like, Kelsey Creek can be hydrologically connected and disconnected depending on where you are. And it could also depend on the time of year. So these conditions are variable, but we wanted just to give you a high level overview of what we mean when we talk about these things. So jumping into actually applying all of this technical information to Big Valley. So we have here a map of all of the stream gauges and information. And so on Kelsey Creek, we've got a DWR KCK shown there in the upper right in orange. And that stream gauge has been operable from 2015 to present day. And then if you go all the way upstream Kelsey Creek down the bottom, it's that green circle. Oh my goodness, my dog. I'm so sorry. Give me a moment. I'm just gonna pause. I'm gonna shut my door. But yes, USGS. Okay. All right. So then USGS is upstream and it has been operable. It's our longest contiguous data set that we have here on Streamflow from 1947 to the present day. And then moving over to Adobe Creek, we also have another USGS monitor. It's upstream of Adobe Creek Reservoir and the Highland Springs Reservoir. It's kind of at the uppermost part of Adobe Creek. And that is discontinuous data, and we don't have it for present day. It was only from 1954 to 1978. So that's a little bit of a historic record and not complete in terms of giving us current conditions, but is still helpful nonetheless. And then the Big Valley Rancheria has placed 3 transducers along Adobe Creek, and they're gathering information. And right now that information isn't directly contributing to Streamflow information. They need to gather a baseline amount of information in order to do some modeling in order to make that Streamflow data. And so that is the amount of data that we have. As you'll note, there are several streams that don't have surface flow data. And that is Manning Creek, McGow Slough, Hill Creek, and Coal Creek. So that is a known data gap. So moving into the data that we do have and going on to Kelsey Creek, I'll just talk about the stream flow. So Kelsey Creek, it varies seasonably, you know, like high flows in the winter and low to no flows in the summer, especially as we're seeing right now in current conditions. And, you know, that upstream.
Megan?
Go ahead.
I think Sarah had a raised question. I think it may be tied to data availability before we go forward.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Sorry, I can't see raised hands.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You know, I wanted to point out that we did submit data for Manning and Coal for our water quality monitoring data, which included velocity information. And we've been doing that since 2011. So, you know, it's not flow, but it's velocity and also, you know, water chemistry conditions. So I'm not sure why that's on the unmonitored list unless you're not taking any velocity information.
Okay, I mean, I think at least from my understanding, the stream flow piece of it is how you make that determination, at least part of the determination for interconnected flow. I don't know how velocity necessarily ties into that, but if Ibrahim, if you have any additional thoughts on
that. We looked at that data, Sarah, and it truly does have the water quality data, but there is no stage or flow data, which kind of a little bit we need to kind of characterize the condition in the creek. Maybe we can follow up and see if you have additional data on how we can use that. But we received that data from you. That's correct.
Yeah, I would like to follow up with you in the near future on that, because we can develop, you know, further develop the stage part of it. We've already done that with a few creeks and can do that for Manning and Coal.
That would be great.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so then we'll revise that and you know, and update the information as we move forward.
Actually, Megan, I have a comment here too. So it's a little confusing because that DWR KCK gauge, there's that gauge ID, and then there's a water data library gauge ID, but the water data library data goes back to 1980, not 2015. So there's a longer record there. And we can send you that gauge number for the water data library gauge.
Okay.
Okay,
Perfect.
please do.
Okay.
Yeah, part of this is the there are some things that we're new to the basin, and so and the data and any information that you all have is really helpful for us in getting a complete story. So thanks for
Yeah, I mean it's we need to kind of figure that out, Megan, because sometimes they replace the gauge or move the gauge. So, but thank you very much. Please send that data over.
Anna, could you send me that citation too? This is Peter.
Sure. Yep.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, just in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and then move on to Kelsey Creek, and there's a discussion there. So like I said, it's variable, the stream flow. And when we're looking at that USGS gauge, which is upstream, we have that whole period of record all the way from 1947 up until present day. And we can see that, that the stream flow varies from year to year. With higher than average precipitation, you get those, higher flows like around 150 CFS, cubic feet per second. And then in really dry years, like the drought back in 1997, you have almost next to no stream flow, which is, people are comparing 1997 to kind of current present conditions. So something to keep in mind. Then, so that's characteristic of Kelsey Creek overall, but then we want to get into its connection to groundwater, because that's the really big piece here. How does Kelsey Creek relate to groundwater? And so using that technical term, it's potentially hydrologically connected to the groundwater basin in some areas, and it's definitely hydrologically connected in others, as we know from the Kelsey Creek detention structure. So we have here this chart, and it has the elevation on the left-hand side, and you can see the orange line is the elevation of the creek bed, Kelsey Creek. And the blue lines are the elevation contours of the groundwater levels. And you can see that the blue dark line, which is spring 2019, which is considered a wetter year, it follows that stream line, the stream bed elevation line, pretty closely. And then once you get into a drier year, as exampled by the fall of 2015, you see that line move away from the stream bed. And so as the conditions change throughout the year or from year to year, the creek might be gaining or losing depending on what the surface elevation is of relative to the groundwater. But this is one of those things where we need additional information of shallow monitoring wells in order to characterize just how closely these two, the stream bed and the aquifer, are connected. But we do want to mention that the stream bed material does play a part in it. Oh, wow, I didn't realize that was animated. I think, Peter, you made this comment on the section of the GSP, is that, upstream of the Main Street Bridge, it's the stream bed is more clay-like, and it's going to be a little bit more impermeable. And so you're not going to get as much recharge. But then as you go downstream from the Main Street Bridge, you get a lot more of that coarse gravel, which is what you see in the Kelsey Creek detention structure, which allows for more infiltration and connection between the stream bed and the aquifer. So then I'll just move on quickly to, there's a well that's located near the DWR KCK gauge. And once we have that additional data from the water library, we can expand this graph and have more years of information, because this well does date back and has more information. But you can see there that the groundwater elevations kind of follow this similar pattern to the stream. So when the stream bed is really high, or the stream flow is really high, you get there's a 1 to 2 month lag, and then you see a rise in the elevation of the well. But then as you know, but this pattern, you know, the high and lows seasonally, it reflects groundwater extraction in the basin, as you know, for irrigation demand or municipal use, as well as the recharge cycles at Kelsey Creek detention structure. So, you know, even though we like the data that we have and the monitoring wells aren't present, we do know, we can see this pattern where the wells are following the stream bed. And there are some other wells located in the surrounding area. This was used as an example just due to its proximity. But there are other wells in the area that show that there is a similar pattern where when Kelsey Creek is high, so are the wells. Then just moving on Kelsey Creek. So, you know, again, we do know that there is this connection between groundwater and surface water. And that is exemplified really well at the Kelsey Creek detention structure. So here, you know, the gravel is very coarse. It allows for great recharge. And when you put those gates down, shown in this picture, the stream bed fills up and you get additional enhanced recharge into the aquifer. So that is what we have on Kelsey Creek. And I'll just pause here for any questions before moving on to Adobe Creek. All right. And Ibrahim or Christy, if you can help me, I can't see raised hands while I'm in presenter mode.
I will absolutely survey it for you, Megan, no worries.
Okay, excellent. So then moving on to Adobe Creek. So there are no current stream flow gauges. As I mentioned, you know, the USGS gauge, it's old. It doesn't have current data. And then the transducers that were placed in by the Rancheria back in 2018, they're not collecting stream flow data, but that data will eventually be able to, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, Anna or Sarah, as I understand it, that information that you're collecting will eventually be able to you know, do some sort of modeling to get stream flow information.
Yeah, I think they need a little bit more data to be able to calibrate the transducers to be able to translate the stage into flow.
Okay.
That's kind of my understanding.
So right now, what we're working with is old data on Adobe Creek. What we're gathering data now, or the Rancheria is gathering data now. But when we look at the data that is available and that we do have, it is important to note that it is upstream of Adobe Creek and Highland Springs reservoirs. And so you're not capturing, you know, what is going down Adobe Creek from those reservoirs, which is important. And, but the data did capture that drought condition where the flow was the lowest that it has been in a couple decades. So from the data that we do have, we can see that it is seasonally variable, that you get, you know, more flows in you know, the spring time and less in the fall, and that it does change from year to year. With higher than average precipitation, you get flows around, you know, 20 CFS, and you can get much lower flows in dry years, more around like the 5 CFS. But the average stream flow, I didn't write it in here, it's around like 11 CFS at this upstream gauge. But we also know that there are these reservoirs and they regulate flow on Adobe Creek. The Highland Creek Springs and Adobe Creek reservoirs are primarily built for flood control purposes, but they have released water on demand to help raise groundwater elevations. And as Sarah and Bethany have told us, that there is no real operation criteria of when these releases happen. It's more of, you know, well owners calling up the county and saying, you know, my well levels are going lower and I'm having difficulty extracting water. Please release water from Adobe Creek and Highland Springs Reservoir. So there are some operation criteria that's required as it relates to flow, but it's not something that is super set in stone and something that we can get information on that would help us better understand the connection between surface water and groundwater. Ibrahim, do you have anything to add?
Nope, it's all good. Yeah.
Okay, you just popped up on my screen as green. Okay, so with the information that we do have, we can see that Adobe Creek is hydrologically connected to the aquifer. And similar to Adobe Creek, that connection is there in the spring season. Again, you see that dark blue line matching that orange line, which is the creek bed. And then it's disconnected in the fall and the dry when it's dry, which is that 2015 contour that you see on the graph there. During dry conditions, Adobe Creek is losing water, so water is going into the ground, and it might be hydrologically disconnected to the aquifer. So the flow that's in Adobe Creek is not actually recharging the aquifer at any point. So that is something that the data shows right now, but we would need additional shallow monitoring wells to characterize when this happens and how. And so that is something that is a known data gap and something that we are planning to include in our project management actions, as the need to gather this type of data so that we can have a better understanding. So that is my portion of the presentation. I'll just pause here before I hand it over to Ibrahim for any questions.
Hi, this is Marina. I just wanted to let folks know that if you check the chat, I did include the link to the water resources page where we have information on the operations of both of those dams.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, well, I will hand it over to Ibrahim then.
All right, I'm going to share my screen.
Okay, so you want me to, okay, perfect.
Yeah. So let me know when you can see my screen.
We can see it.
I see it.
Okay, perfect. So to augment the data sets that we had based on the monitoring, as you're all aware, we have been developing the groundwater model for the area. And the groundwater model is an integrated model, so it does account for the surface water. It's a very important surface water component, all the flows going in the creeks. We use the data sets the limited data sets we have on Adobe Creek, on Kelsey Creek, to help with the model calibration. And one of the outputs the model generate is this surface stream aquifer interaction. And so what does the model does is kind of estimate based on the spring flow, the summer flows, looking at the groundwater condition, how high the groundwater goes up and goes down. It develops estimate for all of the creek we identified in the area, whether it's likely the creeks are gaining or losing. So gaining meaning water is going from the groundwater aquifer into the creek, losing the water is going from the creek into the groundwater basin. And the criteria we're using is simple hydraulic criteria. It's based on the elevation. And so there is a surface elevation, there is an elevation for the creek bed, and then there is the creek stage on top of it, and then there is an elevation for the groundwater. So if the groundwater stage is higher than the creek, the water goes from the groundwater into the creek. If it's reverse, then water flows from the creek into the basin. We also account, depending on the soil surface geology and soils, we also account for permeability factors. So how much the connectivity here. So I highlighted Kelsey Creek in this kind of triangle, as well as rectangle, as well as also Adobe Creek, just for us to compare. So we're here looking at a wet condition. So this is a wet year, and this is the budget you're looking for is just looking at the average over the whole year. So on average, on the whole year, spring and fall, just a wet year, what happens? A good wet year, you would see that Kelsey Creek is gaining in the upper reaches, which basically in our model means groundwater elevation is higher than the creek. And so we anticipate, and the model anticipate, groundwater, the creek is gaining for most of the year on this upper reaches. On the downstream reaches, I think this is probably downstream from Highway 20, you'd see the creek is in orange and red. So if there is flows in the creek, going with the operation of the recharge project on Kelsey Creek, we're losing. The creek is losing water and contributing recharge to the basin. So losing and gaining is kind of bad or good, but losing is basically recharge. So the basin is if you do that intentionally, it might be a good thing. So the creek is recharging the basin. On Adobe Creek, on the other hand, sorry. So on Adobe Creek, on the other hand, what you see is it mostly, I mean, except very high up, close to the reservoirs, there it's most of the year on average it's gaining groundwater elevation, but for most of the creek it's actually losing for most of the year, even in wet years. So we don't see the benefit, we don't see the gaining condition that we see on Kelsey Creek. On Adobe Creek, it's losing most of the time during wet years. And so then if we take a look at a dry year, so again, I'm gonna move slowly. If you look at dry year, the same pattern exists, except on Kelsey Creek, you'll see less flow into the creek, less gain, and more loss. And in Adobe Creek, you see, I'm gonna switch back to wet year. So this is wet year, and this is a dry year. On Adobe Creek, you'll see just getting darker orange, which means just the condition is getting, the loss is getting higher, and how much water is being recharged from, or lost or recharged from Adobe Creek into the basin is increasing. So what's the takeaway? I mean, the takeaway is when you look at the model based on the data we have is consistent with the cross-section we developed along the creeks. That's Megan displayed. That shows the upper reaches of Kelsey Creek typically gain water. The bottom reaches is lose water and recharge the basin. Adobe Creek, for most of its length, it's actually contribute and loses water into the groundwater basin. So that's kind of the still model results lines up with observed data. Any question on just kind of our current understanding and limitation of understanding about the interconnection between surface water and groundwater?
Ibrahim, Sarah has her hand up.
Okay.
Could you just define what wet year and dry year means, and also just confirm the years of the data that are being used for the modeling? Thank you.
Eddie, are you on the call?
I don't see him on here.
Okay. Yeah, I need to get back to you about, I mean, for the model, we modeled the last 30 years. We used data from the mid-1980s up to 2018, and we use that for model calibration. I need to get you specifically which year we used to model the wet condition and which year we used to model the dry conditions. I need to get back to you on that one. But we use the last 30 years of data, starting in the the mid 1980s. That's where we have the most complete record for model calibration.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So if there is just moving forward, we want to talk a little bit about defining the MOs and MTs, and which is MOs are the good measurable objectives, the objective we're going forward, and the MT, the minimum threshold. And I think we need to, we don't want to make things complicated, but probably we need to define a third level in the middle, the warning level, which kind of call it the warning level, because once you hit the minimum threshold, then that's kind of, you bring in the weight of the state. But probably you need a minimum, a warning level in the middle. It kind of triggers action by DSA to correct before you get to the red level. So typically for the groundwater surface water depletion, what we do, you need two metrics side by side to be able to look at and monitor for depletion conditions. One of them is like a surface water gauge, and then near that gauge, you need to have a good shallow groundwater well to be able to see, or a groundwater well probably to look at how groundwater respond to the stream elevation and vice versa, how the declining groundwater elevation affect the stream. So we need to pair a stage with a stage measurement with the well. So in the creek, as we just described, based on the data sets we have right now, we have a DWR gauge at Kelsey Creek downstream, KCK, and then we have the three transducers from the rancheria on Adobe Creek. We hope those will continue in the future, or we would like to propose to be adopted into the monitoring network and be monitored into the future. The two USG, this one USGS gauge is not active anymore, but the USGS gauge on Kelsey Creek is, it's provided very important value and flow. However, it's basically almost at the edge of the basin. We don't have a lot of groundwater activity in this area. Again, it's if there's any groundwater, it will be part of the in the bedrock or the fractured rock, and so it won't provide any meaningful benefit for accounting for groundwater surface water depletion. Ideally, we would have additional gauge on Kelsey Creek in and or around Highway 20. And then that will be paired with groundwater wells to be able to kind of look at the interaction. But we don't have that. That's something we could recommend to have in the GSP as we implement. So that's one way, or most everyone sets how they set the groundwater depletion representative monitoring network or representative monitoring site. There is another way to look at groundwater surface water depletion by relying entirely on the groundwater model, because the model, you can have estimate for how much water leave the creek and how much water goes into the creek. However, you need to have very high level of confidence that the model is accurate and it's representative of the condition. But that's an option. So for now, we're I'm just kind of say probably going with the traditional way, looking at the stage gauge and well adjacent to these groundwater well adjacent to these gauges. So let's first start with the Kelsey Creek gauge.
Can I ask a question here?
Please.
Yeah, thank you. Can we back up? I'm really, really puzzled because, first of all, the term depletion, depleted from what? what are you saying? What do you mean by depletion? That's my first question. And then I have a couple of follow-ups because anyway, let's start there. What's depletion?
So DWR in the Sigma legislation, I think the implicit assumption when they talk about depletion of surface water is there is existing surface water in a stream, and there is beneficial users of those streams. So beneficial users could be recreation, could be fisheries, could be habitat, could be ag diversions. And then because of groundwater activities on the basin, on the adjacent to the creeks, you pump water so hard, you pull surface water out from the creek, resulting in impact to these beneficial uses. So that the unfortunate issue with that definition is because the creeks, all of them in their natural condition, there's even if there's pumping or not pumping, the natural condition, they interact with the surrounding groundwater basin. They gain and they lose. They have spring flows, and then they provide recharge to the basin. And the recharge that they provide is very important for health of the basin. So kind of want to kind of delineate that there is a natural state, but then there is an extra taxing of the surface water on the creek because of the groundwater pumping, and that's what the negative depletion is called. And it's only negative if it affects beneficial uses.
Okay, so the starting is the starting place the state of nature? In other words, what the creeks were, what they look like, and how they ran through the valley, and it's before Euro-Americans arrived? Is that what?
2015.
Okay.
2015.
2015. All right.
Yes.
So what we're looking at then is whether there is further. Well, first of all, we know, of course, in I know going back decades, that when the water gets, I can't use my cursor on years, but in other words, when it gets north of Main Street Bridge, Highway 29, it immediately goes into the underground, almost immediately. And it's done that certainly beginning long before 2015, but in any event, that's certainly going on in 2015. So are we asking about a situation in which, gosh, I don't know what it would be. But to say it's depleted from there, what are you saying? What are you asking? What are you saying? How are you measuring it?
So it's a tough question, but the depletion also could be an issue of timing. I mean, yes, in the summer and fall, or mostly in the late summer, early fall, the creek could be dry most of the time.
Well, it starts earlier than that. It starts around June, 1st of July, it was dry.
Yeah. So then the other condition we could be looking for and monitoring is we don't want the creek to dry in May or dry in April. I mean, you can imagine that if there is species of habitat relying on the creek in the spring, and then because of changes in the future resulting in the creek drying not because of droughts, because of active groundwater extraction. That's kind of the what we're talking about.
So this is John. Can I?
Yeah, help me out here.
Yeah. So the SGMA regulations ask that we are able to quantify the volume of water that is in the ground and is coming out of the ground into the surface water system. So that's a gaining condition. So that volume, millions of gallons or acres of feet or whatever it is going out of the groundwater system into the surface water system.
It doesn't happen.
And so there is obviously there's geography and timing involved, right? But in the bigger concept, there's just a volume of water coming out of the groundwater into the surface water system. And if that volume that's going into the surface water system decreases, that's the depletion. That's the loss of groundwater. So if the systems are connected and groundwater drops due to use or a lack of recharge or for whatever reason, but if groundwater drops elevations, then there will be less of a contribution of groundwater. And eventually the systems could be disconnected. When they are disconnected, then whatever happens to the groundwater doesn't really change surface water at all because they're not in communication.
Okay, well, maybe it would be helpful if we started with a little bit of a description on that. I've lived on Kelsey Creek for 70, I'm over 70, what am I, 76, and my whole life on Kelsey Creek in 2 different locations. Both locations we own property. One is down there in that orange area, property right there. And then the next one is, if you come up the stream and you see that first fork, right about in there, right, a little bit south of and north of that a bit. Okay, so and in that, coming from the water comes, of course, from up on Cobb Mountain and comes down the stream. The bed of Kelsey Creek is confined. It's almost like an aqueduct in Los Angeles because of the clay bottoms and then the erosion of gravel. So you see it very clearly. It gets down to the Main Street Bridge, and your photos most graphically illustrated that. It's down to the Main Street, those 2 pictures you took from the bridge. Upstream, you see water standing. That's where water comes down and comes down all summer to that location, except this year it stopped. And by the way, I looked at the USGS gauge and it said this is the lowest in history. So, and which is true, our place, the water comes, I mean, it's not running here at our place this year, which is just downstream from that gauge. Anyway, but when the water gets past the Main Street Bridge, it disappears. It goes down into underground and dries up over the course of the stream bed dries up all the way down to the lake and remains in that condition all summer. And it, and no doubt, in considerable part because of groundwater pumping, but in essence, the water comes down to the Main Street Bridge and then dumps into the underground aquifer. That's where that happens. There is no water that comes from the underground aquifer into the creek. It's all entirely the reverse. So given that set of facts, in other words, that's what's happening and has been since, well, probably at least since 1950 or before. And I say that because that's when there was beginning of a lot more pumping in Big Valley began, was the boom of the pear industry that happened starting in the was before that, but particularly since World War II. So anyhow, that's physically what's going on there. So now that's where I'm puzzling about when we talk about depletion, groundwater depletion. What are we, given that set of facts, and just assume for the moment that it's borne out by your research too, what are we talking about when we say depletion? In other words, there's no water going into any groundwater to speak of at all until you get to the Main Street Bridge or highway. Main Street Bridge. It really is. It's confined all the way to the Main Street Bridge. Then below that, you get into Big Valley and those gravels, as you saw in your photograph. That water, the other day it was standing because it's so incredibly low, but ordinarily you see the creek coming and pouring over the footings there at the base of the bridge, or that, and then going out a ways into the gravel and disappearing. The last couple of years, it's gotten a little further downstream, which is kind of nice. But
there is no, well, one of the things is there is no gauge here in this upper portion of Kelsey Creek. And for example, if there was a gauge here, you would be able to see, compare it to the flow coming from the USGS gauge. And if it's the same flow, or is it increasing, or there's a difference?
Oh, it's not. That USGS gauge is an absolutely accurate measurement. I mean, you walk the creek, I'll take you down the creek, you walk down the creek, you can see that there's certainly no water coming in. And the water going out is because I mean, I'm looking at my window right now to this whole area. There are no irrigation wells along that creek. Any kind of well is very, very minimal and shallow. So that USGS gauge is invaluable. That is the accurate measure of what water is going into Big Valley.
Yeah, and another thing you look here is that the values is being reported here is kind of fairly small in CFS. It's just very tiny in the magnitude of gain and loss.
Have you compared the USGS gauge to the DWR gauge and the flows?
We have them both here. Let's see.
It's not in this PowerPoint, Ibrahim. Yes, we have, and that is in the section 2.2.2, which is posted on the website, the county's website. There's a graph there that compares the two, and they do have similar patterns, just different amounts of flow. Obviously, there's more flow upstream than there is downstream of the detention center.
Yeah, during the early spring, when the groundwater is full, the aquifers are full in essence. The flows between the two gauges should be pretty close, and because there's no place for water to go, essentially, I think it'd be worth taking a close look at that, because that would be the time of the year when they should be tracing very closely.
Yeah,
Although
I think what our model is kind of trying to show is, maybe this is something kind of we're going to have a little bit of discussion. We'll talk about the model calibration itself. It shows this groundwater elevation here in the spring. It's fairly high, and this is the groundwater. This is the creek bed,
right?
And so, just looking at this one, you anticipate that you will be some, not just from the bottom of the creek coming up, but at least also come from the side seeping in. There is some amount of connectivity and some contribution to the creek. That's kind of what just is hydraulically what it looks like. But then you mentioned the other factors in terms of the soil conditions and stuff like that maybe limit that, but just hydraulically they need to be some seepage, at least from the aquifers into the creek.
There aren't, because there isn't other source of water for the aquifers. I mean, you have these small tributaries that come into Big Valley, but there isn't any source of water with which to then go pour into the creek out here and out in the valley. It just doesn't exist. So it can't begin the assumption that somehow this creek is fed by water coming in from the groundwater aquifers. There's no place for water to come into groundwater aquifers except coming to the creek and going out.
Ibrahim, Sarah has her hand raised as well. I think she wants to jump in the conversation.
Okay, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just looking at the DWR well completion report map application, and there are wells along Kelsey Creek, at least the vicinity of it, and it's all checkable on this site. So and there's also a lot of water rights, surface water uses that are happening in the upper reaches of Kelsey Creek. So there are uses that are happening that could explain what's going on with the surface water levels in those areas, besides just that there's no other groundwater use in that area. I mean, there are uses along the whole reach of the creek.
Yeah, oh, that's true. That's absolutely true. In fact, we've been one of the major users. We used to pump out of Kelsey Creek, but the flows have gotten lower. No, way up on Cobb Mountain, it's a resort area. They pump water there for golf course and stuff. So users, yes, there are users upstream for sure. But in terms of groundwater users, there's no significant groundwater up here at all. In fact, wells, if you drill a well near the creek, you're going to be disappointed. We get our water from a perched water table, and we're 100 yards from the creek. This perched water table is higher than the creek itself. It just goes to show how little there is going into the creek. So anyhow, point being, yes, definitely, Sarah, you're right. There are users upstream, but once it gets to the Main Street Bridge or gets to Big Valley, it's going into the valley, into the aquifers, and it's because of the pumping. Certainly a big part of it is why there's space, if you will. In other words, why the creek is higher, and that's the direction of flow. But I suggest to you, and I'm happy to take you around, or you guys can do your own research, but there's no flow in Big Valley. There's no flow from groundwater into Kelsey Creek. I've never seen it, ever, evidence of it. So anyhow, I understand the concept that you've described in terms of.
Yeah.
So that's why then we come to the question. That's why I'm leading up to this, coming back to the original question. When we're talking about depletion, are we talking about groundwater? I don't know what we're talking about, truthfully. Given the facts of this case, what do we mean? What are we talking about?
So John, what's how we can better describe what we mean by depletion?
Well, the depletion is just a reduction in the amount of groundwater that comes into the surface water system. And if
Okay.
that doesn't exist, what I just described, then there is no depletion.
Right. Well, there's certainly no depletion in Big Valley in that sense. In other words, there's no flow of water no flow in Big Valley, groundwater into the creek. I mean,
You have to have data. You can't just be observations.
Pardon me?
Yeah, you have to have data. It can't just be
Sure.
observations.
Look at the data's right there on the DWR gauge.
Yeah.
And the water stops running. It quits. And as a matter of fact, it stops running around May.
So what we have done, I mean, again, the problem we're dealing with here is not unique to this basin. It's everywhere in the state, because as people kind of developed the networks in the past and monitoring, but most people has not been paying close attention to this question of groundwater surface water depletion. And so what we have been doing in the last few years, last 10, 15, 20 years, people has been building these, as I described them before, the nested wells close to a existing gauge. So for example, the Kelsey gauge here, it goes up and down, and then we build close to it like a nested wells. And those nested wells will be like in the first 20 feet, and then 50 feet, and then 100 feet, and then 200 feet in one well. And then we coordinate that and do a groundwater pumping test. So we go ask someone to run their wells.
Yes.
That's far away. And then we look at that nested well as well as also the stage. And then we see what happens. So we run the pumps for a day, for 2 days, and then we see which one of those nested wells, so that production well, say it's like 200 feet deep. Do we see a change in ground elevation in the 200 feet nested well? Do we see it at the 100, at the 50, at the 20 level? Do we see it, and how fast and how much? And then do we also see a similar change in the creek? That's the way to get a definitive answer if there is a connectivity, there is depletion happening because of the pumping, and how much of it. And again, it depends on geology and factors. And in some areas we see, yep, it happened. The minute it happened, the creek goes dry. In other areas, the wells, even close by wells, goes in, nothing happens in the creek because there is like a confining layer. There's clays and stuff like that. And the well is going from a deep aquifer, and the shallow aquifer is kind of protected. And so we don't see that impact.
Right.
So without this information here, I think we don't want to go off a limb and say, absolutely, there is no hydraulic connectivity. Or on the other way side, we want to go out and say, absolutely, it's completely connected and absolutely happened. I think we need to just kind of acknowledge there's observation, this is what we observe, this is what we see. However, ultimately, there is a big data gaps. And one of the very first action in the GST implementation, we want to see if we can add a gauge or more, and then work with DWR to implement these nested wells, and then go ahead and do these aquifer tests just to get all the data we need, and then kind of say definitively, this is what we see, this is what happens, this is how much it happens, and this degree of it.
But let me follow up with a question. Would it not be useful if you were to have a well close to the creek, and there are some, and you measured the depth of that well, standing water depth, and compare it to the depth of the creek, the elevation, let's put it that way, the elevation of the standing water in the well compared to the elevation of the creek bed? I mean, it's certainly, at a minimum, the creek would have to be lower than that standing water in the well if you were going to assert that that was, you know.
Correct. Yeah, correct. And I said that, I mean, we've been there. The Kelsey Creek is bone dry in this area in the summer.
Yes.
Adobe Creek is mostly dry in the year.
Yes.
And so that's fine. And that's something we will describe. And that's kind of a case of hydraulic disconnectivity. However, during other time of the year, there's flow in the creeks. There might be some connectivity, and I'm just kind of trying to be, to go as far as the data can allow me to go without taking a step too far.
Yeah, certainly there's connectivity between the creek going into the underground aquifer. I mean, that's obvious, and that's true. Yeah. The question has to do with the other, and then the question then has to do with depletion. And it sounds like, if I'm understanding you, well, let's see, it's depletion and surface flow. There's where we get a difference. 2015.
Hey, Ibrahim, sorry, I got cut off. I just wanted to add something quickly to this conversation with the maps. So these maps that we're showing when we're talking about dry and wet, so our model period runs from 1984 to 2018, right? And we have wet years, dry years, wet years, dry years. We just took an average of all the dry years and then an average of all the wet years to sort of get a sense of what things look like. But what we can do with this model is we can look at, we have monthly time steps. So we could pick a period, a known wet period, and we could look at this, you know, through monthly time steps or quarterly time steps. So it might change a little bit. So I don't know if that adds or takes away from the conversation, but I just wanted to mention that.
I'm just trying to get a handle on depletion. What are we talking about when we say depletion of surface water? Deplete from what?
It's a reduction in surface water, and that could be because there's no water there. It's been taken away upstream. It could be a depletion caused by pumping in a regional sense. It's a little tricky to model, and really the only way to sort of quantify it is, I think Ibrahim mentioned, is you've got to have a monitoring network that is monitoring wells, different depths of those monitoring wells, staggered away from the creek, as well as gauge info and stream information in the creek. So
I hear you, all those gauges. I still don't know what you're measuring.
How much surface water is being lost to being taken out of the system, out of the groundwater, out of the surface water system. It's being depleted. The flows are being depleted.
So I mean, all of it, of course. I mean, depending on the time of the year, mind you, but gosh, you're still not putting it together, guys. I mean, what you're looking at is a state of nature in which it gets depleted long before this. In other words, it disappears. Water disappears in the gravels. You know, it's always done that. It isn't to say that there isn't water down there somewhere. There might be.
Yeah, I think you know, you made a good point about it's dry in the summer. So we get that. But then the only other question is, if, say, on average, I mean, let me jump to a condition here. Say, on average, this is a better graph. So
and Sarah, I see your hand up. Sarah, we'll get to you just right after this one.
Yeah. So I mean, again, this is Kelsey Creek. This is
Kelsey Creek.
Yeah. So this is great. So basically, this is I'm looking here as the green line is the top of the spring levels, and the red line is the top of at the bottom is the lowest observed spring level. Okay. So this is the highest spring. This is the lowest spring. The red line. So that's the range that's kind of has been happening. And maybe I'm just going out of a limb here, Peter, and saying spring is important for some habitat or species. I don't know what, for example. And then this is a condition where the creek is running. And then what happens is, and this is the groundwater elevation, and the creek is running high. But then because of groundwater pumping for any reason during the spring, these levels drop significantly lower, even in the spring.
Yeah, well, later in the spring, May.
Or even in the spring, I'm just saying at early spring, anytime in the spring, there is a condition, there is a big development happened. Someone put I don't know, a big plant to manufacturing facility. And they start pulling so much water that the spring level dropped below this level in a way that started to deplete the spring, the stream in the spring, even in March and April, say, and affecting certain species. That becomes, in our terms, a depletion. That becomes, and that's not happening now, but going to happen in the future. That's become a depletion in the spring that's need to be monitored for and accounted for. And then again, some creeks, some streams run year round. Here we don't have that. They don't run year round. They're dry in the summer. That's fine. Then what we're monitoring for is not summer condition. We're monitoring maybe for a spring condition. And if nothing happens in the spring condition, and it's all remains high between these two observed level, nothing happens, then we're good. I mean, again, but having a plan without RMS, without MO, without MT for groundwater depletion, I think we will get in trouble with DWR. Even if we try to justify that the creek dries in the summer. This is fine, but we're just going to monitor in the spring. That's kind of.
Peter,
It's going into their ground effort. I'm sorry.
Do you mind just hanging tight just for a moment? I want to get Sarah in on the conversation here, and we can certainly revisit and go back. Sarah.
Sure.
Just a couple of things, but before I ask them or comment on them, I do want to say there are other, users and beneficial uses in these areas besides just agriculture. So just keep in mind, that trying to make it work for one particular group is not necessarily making it work for other groups. And this is supposed to be sustainable groundwater management. So, we're looking forward to, a full evaluation of, in this short time frame, of the data and coming up with something that's gonna work for all engaged. But I did want to just bring up a couple items about the wells, and I think I've mentioned this before, but there is supposed to be an evaluation of well usage and groundwater pumping on surface water flow if these wells are installed near the within the riparian zone of the creeks, and that is supposed to be through a 1600 permit through Fish and Wildlife. And there are no permits that have been granted to wells along Adobe and Kelsey Creeks from Fish and Wildlife to do that evaluation. And that's basically because there's very little communication and connection between environmental health, who grants these permits, and state Fish and Wildlife, who is supposed to give 1600, or environmental health grants the well drilling permits. Fish and Wildlife is who would be giving the 1600 permits for a stream bed alteration. So, I think that's one piece of information that we've really lost out on, because they're now basically saying we won't, we don't have the ability to go out and check on these things. People have to be turned in, which is like, nobody wants to turn in their neighbors for, groundwater pumping. It's affecting the surface water. It would be nice. I'm just putting this as like an action item. If environmental health, when they were granting these permits, had a closed feedback loop mechanism of you know, depending on where these wells were drilled, that there would be an automatic, you know, or planned to be drilled, that there would be an automatic review from or requirement that they also have to show that communication and interaction with fish and wildlife. But that is not the case right now. And as I said, there are no 1,600 permits for wells that are along Adobe and Kelsey Creeks.
May I just ask a question and comment? Sarah, what's the setback requirement? How close to the stream do they have to be in order to have a 1,600 permit?
It has to be within the riparian zone.
Yeah.
So
okay.
that will switch.
If you look on Kelsey Creek, I doubt that they're, and well, you see wells, what do you see of wells? But those are old wells. I doubt there are any wells that have been drilled in any recent time along Kelsey Creek or riparian. In fact, that isn't particularly where you want wells. So anyway, I just make that comment real quickly. And I agree with you. But I'm concerned about all these beneficial uses. I have a tremendous interest in every single one of them. And every single one of them, what I'm concerned about, and is that this be fact-based. We know what we're talking about. We know what we're assuming. And I certainly know what I'm talking about because I watched it forever. And Sarah, for her research, she knows a lot, which she's working on too. So for example, that gauge up there, USGS gauge, is the gauge. It's the only information that you have, and it's a good source of how much water is coming into Big Valley through Kelsey Creek. And that's got to be the starting place right there.
Okay.
Then it goes into the groundwater. Groundwater. Well, of course, it runs until the pumping starts significantly right around the end of May, 1st of June. And then in that period of time, from June on, why the water that's coming down the creek all the way to the Main Street Bridge, as measured by that gauge, that water is recharging the underground aquifer. That's what's going on physically. And it's not a whole lot more complicated than that, but certainly there's no beginning and round, and you start pumping and that's the beginning of the irrigation season. That's when there's not sufficient moisture in the soil to support the pear trees and the vineyard and so forth. So you start pumping, irrigating these guys. And we've been doing that for 50 years. So anyhow, and then that is when you start having these, the water's going out of the creeks, the surface water. So anyhow, I pass that on. I don't mean to be quarrelsome, but I really
No. It's a good discussion, Peter, and I think it's a very important perspective, because I think maybe what we lost in this conversation is, as what Sarah raised, is discussion about the beneficial uses. This whole thing is not to monitor for the sake of monitoring. It's just looking at what are quantifying or defining what are the beneficial uses on streams and creeks, and what measures we need to put in place to protect these beneficial uses. That's the whole idea.
No. The starting place is having the correct facts and knowing what the system is doing. That's the starting place. Then you look at the beneficial users and see what their users are and how we can go and protect all of those interests. But until we have for example, speculating that the groundwater is coming into Kelsey Creek, somebody's got to show me some evidence of that, because there is none that I have ever seen, and it's not documented by the data that you're getting from those two gauges. So anyhow, that's
one of the Eddie, if you're still on the call, and John. So this is kind of a major concern here about the idea about how the model identifying gaining section and losing sections.
Yeah, there we are. Gaining and losing sections. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. So that's something. I know there is in the model we have only two variables: the elevation, the groundwater elevation, and relative to the ground elevation or a stream elevation.
Right.
That's one, and the other factor is the soil conductivity, hydraulic conductivity, and soil permeability.
Yeah.
And one of those two variables that's kind of define the model. So that's something we probably need to look into and just kind of double check that and kind of get back and verify we're getting all of this right.
Yeah. That's good. Thanks.
Sarah, you mentioned something about available beneficial, the different type of beneficial uses. I think you're probably referring to the, for example, the hitch on the creek. Anything else? And that will be topic we will kind of talk about in the next GDE meeting. Any other beneficial uses on the creek beside the ag and the hitch? And the GDEs in general?
Yeah, GDEs in general. You know, I guess the other part of the lack of 1,600 permits from the well owners along Adobe and Kelsey Creeks is that, you know, we've been told by Fish and Wildlife that, I'm sorry, we've been told by the State Water Resources Control Board that if there's depletions of surface water that are impacting beneficial uses, you basically have to, you know, the downstream users have to like lodge official complaints and basically, you know, start going through the legal process. So, you know, that is really a difficult thing to do in a small community and also with a disadvantaged community. So, you know, I don't know if wells along, you know, domestic well, not just domestic wells, but domestic surface water users along the these dry areas of the creeks are doing anything about it. But, you know, I don't think there's any data at this point, but, you know, you do have domestic users that are pulling from, I mean, it just basically riparian rights, you know, and if basically the way that we have to get, to get it solved is to like sue the upstream users. That's just really unfortunate, but that's the way it's set up according to the State Water Resources Control Board. So yeah, I would say downstream users, you know, I've seen the very, you know, the lower reaches of both creeks, well, in particular Adobe, dry, you know, and we have through the earlier part of the year, and I don't know what you know, what riparian users are doing, you know, how they're even managing. So, you know, and they're not really here to speak about it, and there's not really a tracking system at the state or local level about that. But basically, they have to sue to not be impacted anymore. So I just want to make sure that gets thrown in there, that you know, that there are a lot of riparian rights holders along you know, all creeks, and they are impacted when you have low groundwater levels, or I'm sorry, low surface water flows.
Okay. In the beginning of the meeting, I think it was mentioned that we didn't have the complete data record for Kelsey Creek, and this is basically a snapshot from the DWR website about the gauge. Yes, it started from 1984 all the way to 2020, but I think we need to go back and kind of check with DWR, because it seems like there is a problem with the gauge. If you can look at here, when the gauge go dry, the lowest level here is few feet higher than what it used to before, between 2008 to 2015, and then the gauge level was a little bit different again in the 2000s up to 2005, between 1997 to 2005, and then a little bit different level earlier. So we just need to kind of check with DWR if there is a datum issue or how the data is being reported, and we can reconcile the data and be able to use it. So this is a challenge. I'm just gonna run through this one, understanding that we have a lot of issues to discuss. So this is one of the wells in dots blue, close to the, it's not very close, but the nearest well with a more complete record we have to the DWR gauge. And again, trying to see if there is any correlation between the stream flow. Again, it goes high in the spring and then it just dries out, goes up and then dries out. And it dries out regardless, the creek dries out regardless of what the groundwater pumping is happening along Kelsey Creek. Again, we have a much longer record on that well, and so hopefully we can extend the DWR data back to 1984, kind of get a better pattern. On Kelsey Creek, on Adobe Creek, again, Soda Bay, this is a downstream close to the lake. Again, the nearest well we have doesn't have a complete record, but then we have the stage that doesn't extend back. So we have a very limited set of data in terms of how we set the RMS data we have. On the Argonaut Road, which is kind of a little bit better, we have a little bit of an overlap between the well here, elevation, and the creek. But again, it's kind of very little, about like 2 or 3 years worth of data overlap. And what we're seeing, I guess, is kind of the groundwater condition, especially in 1977-76 drought. It's kind of just went extremely low. Again, we see that in 1987. But then most since then, we haven't seen that lowest level until 2015 drought in the summer. This again at Bill Hill Road, much higher in the creek. Again, the same issue. We have a very little overlap between the two wells. So, which is kind of, I'm just run through this quickly, but I want to go back to the question here is, by law, we need to talk about the nature of the surface water interaction. We have a question about that. We noted the comment. We'll go back and kind of revisit that issue. Next step is to define how we're going to monitor. As I mentioned, there's 2 options. Either we have gauge with well close by, so we can see, you can kind of see what's happening in the creek and what's happening in the groundwater wells. If there is truly no connectivity, then that monitoring is kind of, it's beside the point, because there is nothing to monitor for. Or the other option is to report out annually, just you have the groundwater model and then you do a groundwater run based on the observed hydrology and kind of estimate what is the surface water groundwater depletion looks like. I mean the gain and the loss. And again, that means you have a model that you have high confidence in, which I know there is still question about this model. So that's kind of leaves us here in needing to go back to the drawing board and figure out where do we go from here. Okay. So that's all I have, all we have for today. Any questions, comments, suggestions about our next steps of what additional information? I know I noted the number of information we need to look into, but any additional ideas, thoughts we should consider?
Ibrahim, if I can give just a chance for Sky, who's calling in with us, to see if he has any questions. I know that he can't raise his hand. So Sky, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a comment really, and maybe It's a question. Thank you very much.
You bet.
So Peter, I listened to your comments and I was fascinated by them, by your extensive experience. And I heard you mention that, the old slogan like Memorial Day is a traditional start of pear irrigation. But the one thing I think it's sort of incomplete because you didn't talk about frost protection. And I know over in the Russian River Basin, frost protection during dry springs particularly has been a major issue. So I'm thinking you probably thought about it, and I'm kind of wondering what ideas you have about how to keep on top of the effect of frost protection water on Kelsey Creek.
Thank you, Sky. What I'm going to punt and invite you to our next, what is the ground? No.
The GDE.
GDE, right. I'm making a presentation on exactly that subject, Sky, and there's a lot of data, and so please come, and I'll show it. I'll talk about it because it's really, really important, and it evaluates the question of what's the impact of frost protection pumping on Kelsey Creek, and more specifically, what effect is there from frost protection pumping on the hitch, because that's the focus of that committee. So anyway, I don't mean to just bump this along, but I've got a lot of material that we can share. I'll send you the slides ahead of time so you can take a look at it. But it's
well, that's really good because it's a complicated issue. I mean, it is.
Yes.
So that's great. So when is that meeting?
It's September 2nd, and Sky, I had sent you a calendar invite, but I'm happy to re-forward it to you so that you have the information.
Okay.
And it's the same link you used, or the same phone number you used to get on today. So we're using the same one.
I intend to be there.
And that one's, yeah, that's 3 o'clock also. No, yes, I guess it is 3 o'clock, according to my calendar. Am I right?
I'm
Christine?
checking that really quick. Yep, you are correct. 3 o'clock on Thursday, September 2nd.
Yeah, we'll be talking all about that because it's terribly important for everybody.
Yep.
Sarah, I saw your hand go up and then come down. Did you have a question or comment?
No, I took it away. Thanks.
Okay.
This is Anna. I have a quick question, Ibrahim. I was just wondering if the modeling that you've done so far, if that can help determine sort of the priority areas, if there were going to be additional wells installed, where those should be, and if that sort of kind of adaptive approach to, you know, we have this right now, but these are the priority areas to get more wells in for monitoring, if that can be done with the model or not.
Yeah, I think once we kind of refine the model calibration, that could be definitely one of the consideration, in addition to also just the observation on the ground about areas or anecdotal information about areas that will dry early or more important for a specific habitat or species.
Okay, thank you.
So this is John. One thing we can think about is RMS, that on the surface water system, we often think of wells, but does it make sense to put in an additional stream gauge station, and then someone would have to measure throughout the year?
Yeah, one of the gauges we people have talked about is be able to measure the releases from Highland Springs and Adobe Spring, or Adobe Reservoir. Right now, there isn't a way to measure how much being released, and at least that could be very helpful in kind of looking at that system on Adobe Creek.
Sarah, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say we've been doing outreach on this, but I thought I should mention it in this meeting as well, that Big Valley has funding to install sonic water level indicators in wells along Adobe and Kelsey Creeks. And we also have funding to put pressure transducers in the creeks themselves. So we've already gotten some people signed up for this, and we'll be downloading the data on a quarterly basis and providing it to them. These things are going to measure the water levels in the wells on I think every 15-minute basis, I believe. So it's going to be fascinating information for the well owners, and also helpful information to see that groundwater surface water interaction in these areas. So if you know anybody along Kelsey or Adobe, or within a half mile or so, and has a domestic well or an agricultural well and would like to participate, is basically, you know, they don't have to do anything except for allow us to install this stuff, and then, you know, we'll be able to share all of that information with them. So
It's Sarah, those were the same folks that you were putting out the message that that they are welcome to join us for any of our meetings too, correct? Because that'd be a wonderful opportunity to let them know what we're doing.
yeah, that good point. I can do some additional outreach and mention that as well.
Yeah, let me know if you need any like little blurbs or anything, like what size, what word count, anything like that, and I can provide it for you.
Thanks, Christy. That's great.
Christy, I think that's all what we have for today.
You don't want to keep people all the way till 5 o'clock on a Friday?
No. We want to give them early weekends.
Peter, did you have a question or comment? Oops, you're on mute, Peter.
Just to respond to John's comment about
Sure.
stream gauge, I think that would be a good idea if you took, and again, you might want, one suggestion would be one near Highway 29 and then correlate that to the USGS gauge upstream. I think you'll find they're very, very close and that there really isn't any loss to speak of. But that would then, even if it's only for a relatively short period of time, because you could then confirm that one way or not, but that USGS is really measuring how much water is being dumped into these aquifers via Kelsey Creek, because I think that's really is what's happening.
Okay,
Anyway.
That's really good. Thank you.
All right. Well, I don't see any more hands. I do want to acknowledge that this weekend there's a red flag warning for the entire North State. So I wish all of the folks up in Lake County good stead and goodwill toward.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been rough.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it
Yeah.
has. Yeah.
Well, thank you,
Best of
Ibrahim.
luck and stay safe, everyone. Okay.
Thank you. Have a good weekend, everyone.